Good day, I'm Junior Researcher Adam Southgate, and today's lecture will be covering the Sub-Sphere Parth Marw. I'd appreciate that all hunters please subscribe as to not miss any future lectures, and also if you enjoy the lecture and find it informative, please like the video and click the bell to ensure you do not miss any future announcements. I would also be very happy to hear your thoughts, views, and stories of your own interactions with the monsters of the spheres in the comment area of this video. Also, I'm always ready to answer any questions you may have, and please share these lectures with any hunters you feel would benefit from them. So, to begin, as always, we'll start with our general announcements. Firstly, and somewhat alarmingly, we have had a notable uptick in hunters who have seemingly gone missing. While a certain level of this is normal due to the nature of the job, the amounts we are seeing is cause for concern. The most recent disappearance involved one journeyman hunter, Phillips. Upon investigating his workshop, the gamekeepers found some alarming things. His hunter's gear, a must for all hunters within the field, remained at the location, which implies that he did not get taken during a hunt. The workshop itself was left in a state of disarray, with tools and weapons left around the room and upon the floor. It in fact looked as though a struggle had taken place at the location, however no bullet damage was discovered. His hunter's notebook was found at the location, and while it begins as any hunters would, as we go to the more recent pages, Hunter Phillips begins writing about an oppressive, almost pressure weighing upon him. Even his handwriting seems more laboured within his final entries, and most worryingly of all, his final entry consisted of only 4 words, that of, "He is calling me." As to what this could mean, we're at a loss. This may not even be connected to the other disappearances, but we are not ruling it out. We instruct all hunters to work in teams of at least 2 until the situation is resolved. Secondly, we have an odd situation developing within the northern part of the country, along the border with England. This strange development is that redcaps have been sighted within the area. These creatures typically breach along the English-Scottish border and are not seen within Wales, however, now this appears to have changed. The creatures themselves are murderous by nature, needing their titular cap to be soaked within fresh blood to sustain their lives. On top of this, they also possess the same sadistic streak emblematic of the Fey Sphere. We were lucky enough to be warned about this developing situation by freelance hunter the Slumbering Sanctuary, who also, through his contacts, gained some useful information about the beasts so that they could be hunted. The more worrying issue, however, is not the redcaps themselves, but rather who is transporting and releasing them into Wales. As stated, they typically breach at the English-Scottish border, and the distance from there to Wales is too large for them to go unnoticed by the KSG. This implies that someone has been deliberately capturing, moving, and releasing the creatures into Wales. Whether this individual or group is mundane or not is unknown, however, we cannot allow this to continue, especially due to our inexperience dealing with these entities. We would like to assemble 2 groups of hunters for this specialty contract. The first, aided by 3 Scottish hunters who have volunteered to aid us, will hunt down and eliminate the redcaps already released. We suggest reading freelance hunter the Slumbering Sanctuary's comment on the creatures that was left under the beginning instructional video for a detailed breakdown. The second team, with the permission of the KSG, will go to the English-Scottish border, where, working with the KSG, they will investigate possible culprits for this situation. Whoever is doing this must have access to either powerful magics or sufficient resources, as beyond capturing a redcap alive, never mind a group of them, the transportation would require a large cold iron cage. The elimination team will need at least 15 hunters of journeyman rank or above, while the investigation team should only require 10 hunters, however, these will need to be at master rank. If you are interested in the contract, please contact your local order office. To begin today, we will need a quick recap about sub-spheres. The spheres, as we call them, are separate universes to our own, with differing laws of physics, mathematics, biology, and chemistry. Some are of an equivalent size to our own, while others dwarf ours in scale. The sub-spheres are spheres that have reached the end of their natural lifespan, and then gone beyond. From our limited understanding, once a sphere has suffered its heat death, it begins to shrink back down to a singular point, then suddenly re-expanding, and all the events within that sphere repeat again. With subspheres, they are locked within that shrinking phase, typically only holding a single solar system or galaxy. This can be due to a number of factors, however all are initiated by the breaching of another sphere throwing off the cycle. Within most subspheres you will find a god entity that, due to their immense power, are able to hold the sphere's structure together, however in a diminished state. While these god entities almost certainly did not originate within the sub-sphere they now find themselves within, they have been there long enough to fully make it their own, the sub-sphere being a literal reflection of their being. Subspheres appear to greatly outnumber the greater spheres, however the regularity of breaches from them appears to be in direct correlation to the power of their god entity. Within these subspheres, these beings rule unopposed, quite literally, as due to the small size of these subspheres, it is impossible for anything to be done within them without their knowledge. Today's subject, the Parth Marw subsphere, is a typical example of one of these miniature universes, ruled over by an unknown god being with unknowable intent. A breach from the Parth Marw subsphere is rather a quiet affair, one that most of the time goes completely unnoticed. Unlike with most of the threats we face, no slathering beast or wily trickster appears. In fact, to any observer who did not know, nothing would be coming through. There would be a flash of light, like with all breaches, and then it would be over, but this is what hides its sinister nature. A 6 meters and 48 centimeters, or roughly 11 feet for the Americans among us, across ring is created. Anything within this zone, down to bacteria and viruses, will instantly die. There is no effect or telltale shimmer to denote this dead zone. It is simply a small spherical area where life cannot exist. If breaching within a rural or wild area, these zones are easy to identify by the collection of dead plants and animals unlucky enough to either be in the zone when it breached or wander in afterward. If breaching within a populated area, the effect is more subtle and devastating. Due to the lack of plant life or wandering animals within, say, a city, these zones can go completely unnoticed until it is far too late. As I'm sure you can imagine, a person could accidentally enter one of these zones, immediately die, and then cause the deaths of others who rush to help the first person. However, even with this scenario, it is not the worst case, as we can respond in a timely manner as the zone creates panic and confusion. The worst case scenario is that the zone breaches within a populated area, but somewhere with low foot traffic. These zones can sit in wait for months at a time, being able to last around 5 to 6 months without a victim, until someone enters them, and then they can use the deceased person's voice to call others. Acting in a similar manner to a Venus flytrap, the dead zones have shown the ability to call out in the voice of any of its victims. The voice does not emanate from the corpse itself, but rather from the air within the zone, and the words it speaks only poses new questions. I'm going to play for you a short recording of this speech.
Help, please. Are you there?
The question this creates is the dead zone choosing what to say? These phrases are all along the theme of calling attention, which implies that the zone is choosing the words that are most likely to bring more people to itself. However, when trying to communicate with the dead zone, it simply continues this action. This does not answer the question of whether or not it is choosing these words, however, as it may simply not care what we have to say or be incapable of hearing. The idea has been put forward that the dead zones pull these words from their victims' minds, and that the entire effect is purely autonomic, requiring no thought. The problem we face is that how does one classify an area of ground that acts like a predatory plant? We have no anatomy to study and very little behavior to analyze, so all we can do is extrapolate. A very popular theory is that the dead zones are tendrils of the Parth Marw subsphere's god entity, a being anathema to life, at least within our sphere's definition of life, that preys upon living beings. This is somewhat corroborated by the time limit. A dead zone which goes unentered for long enough will dissipate within 5 to 6 months, while those that are fed will also dissipate once a certain threshold of life has perished within it. The problem with this theory is that the time limit could also apply to any number of other things, such as the death sustaining the field that once reaching a certain capacity simply fails to maintain its integrity. There simply is no way to know for sure. We have, over the years, done a tremendous amount of testing upon dead zones with very little advancement, until one specific test that had both interesting but also tragic results. The experiment involved a researcher with a linked MMB. He wanted to see if the death field would affect the MMB in the same way it does other life. To this end, he linked himself to the MMB so that it would have a conscious mind, and had it pushed into the dead zone. The moment the MMB entered the zone, the researcher, who was 100 meters away, died. While this at first was surmised to be the MMB overloading, the backfire killing the researcher, this was not in fact the case. Once the dead zone had dissipated, it was found that the MMB was both intact and still functioning. This should be impossible. If the MMB user dies, the MMB should shatter, but in this one case, it didn't. Wanting desperately to find out what was happening, the team landed on a pretty radical solution. They gave the MMB a Pinocchio frame, along with the Pinocchio eyes. Such a thing had been attempted in the past, however, to no success. However, in this case, it worked. While the MMB was still an exact copy of the original researcher's mind that had linked to it, it was now a fully autonomous being, allowing it to connect to the Pinocchio prosthetics. The wooden being was unable to hear or speak, given that there are no Pinocchio prosthetics that fill those functions, but it could see and write. Through this written communication, we discovered that the MMB was still a copy of the researcher's mind, and while somewhat perturbed by its lack of bodily sensations, was happy to communicate. It gave a detailed description of what it experienced while it was within the dead zone, and this is where it gets strange. From the MMB's perspective, it was within the dead zone for millennia, and for most of the time the link between itself and the researcher was still active, however reversed. Any damage that should have happened to the MMB's psyche instead happened to the researcher. It described a sense of falling through a dark void that went on eternally. It described the all-encompassing fear it felt from the researcher, and it described how it could see as the researcher's mind was painfully and slowly stripped away to nothing, like using a potato peeler until all that is left is ribbons. We still don't know what any of this really means, but it is the closest we've gotten to insight on the subject. Today, the MMB in question is called Pinocchio, a name he chose himself based on his wooden body. He did not wish to use the researcher's name out of respect. He now works as a researcher with, funnily enough, the Pinocchio program under close supervision, aiding in creating and testing new prosthetics. So, how do you deal with such a threat as hunters? Well, the first goal is to secure the area. You should be able to find the rough location of the dead zone by the bodies. Once done, set up a road or waterworks facade to keep civilians away. This can be done with aid from the Order, who will send you support staff to aid you in this endeavour. Secondly, you'll need to map out the dead zone. This is typically done with the use of a great many small potted plants and a long stick to dangle them from. Some less ethically minded hunters have been known to use small animals for this purpose. Your aim is to, while holding the plant at the end of the stick, mark out where the plant dies. Once it perishes, place the plant on the ground below where it died. Repeat this action until you've created a visible ring. Your cover should block visible access to what you're actually doing to avoid questions about your actions. Once the zone is mapped out, a work tent should be carefully erected over it so that nothing can enter its effect. After this, the Order will take over maintaining this cover, removing the bodies and acting as though work is being done. Each day we will test through the use of a bacteria dish if the zone has dissipated. Once it has, we will pack up and leave the area. This is actually why workmen have such a bad reputation within Britain for taking so long to complete their task. It's simply due to the fact that they are not actually real workmen and are instead groups like ourselves who are guarding a dead zone. There is something extremely unsettling about the instant death the dead zone creates. If we perish fighting against a monster with too many teeth or a spell cast by a fae, there is an element of fair play. While the odds may be against us, there is a chance to survive these encounters, but with the dead zones, there is no chance. You simply die. There is no bombast or spectacle. You just cease to be. Something about that just feels incredibly unfair to me, as if we are robbed of our ability to fight and flail against the inevitable. But that will be all for today. With Arthur's might and Merlin's wisdom, thank you.